So what's the problem? The world is increasing and accelerating in complexity. We are developing increasingly complex models to make sense of the world, but individuals, institutions, and policymakers don't have access to the data and the models they need to map the situation, map the likely impact to their levers that they can use. Also, in the realm of public debate, fractionalization of worldviews could be helped by providing well-modeled maps of important oppositional opinions to shed light on how they are modeled and why people see different situations differently. So Delphi collaboration aims to do this in areas of TAI risk to identify kind of high impact levers and provide these models for people that need them.
So why do we need the Delphi collaboration protocol? We realize that today, as we're going towards TAI, there's a lot of collaboration need across different groups that are trying to figure out which levers they should be pulling, what resource allocation plans they should be making. Data collection is quite hard. World model building is already difficult. And as soon as they are built, they kind of go out of date. So building this collaboratively with real-time data and input would actually be quite valuable. And this also builds towards a post-AI future where a lot of resource allocation today already happens with AI. This, as more and more speed of decision making is shrinking, we do need a platform in which a consensus model of real humans can also vet forecasts and plans that AI systems are making over an experimentation space where we can reason on outcomes of policy decisions and interventions. One thing we realized was we're already all kind of working on this from different aspects, on scenario modeling, forecasting aspects, or policy making, and trying to figure out what our best budget allocation or resource allocation processes are. And the angle we wanted to take here is, can we build an entity that basically turns reports that some of our teammates have created? Conrad was working on this report, for example, that is robust, but as soon as it is published in a PDF format, goes out of date. Is there a way for this to actually stay live with new events that are happening to be continuously enriched so that we can continue building on that? We have even more complex world models that are not necessarily easy to interpret. So the question is, how can we make these to be easy and accessible to decision makers, and at the same time easy to collaborate and build for those that are building these world models? And some of our inspiration slash potential collaborators, the way we're thinking about it is something between the way Kaggle will create bounties or have projects on open source models, with the philosophy that our world in data is taking on creating world models that ultimately are going to be better for planning sustainability or resource allocation or scientific development, with a lens like Metaculus or Manifold on planning towards forecasting with different rigorous decision-making processes.
And obviously making use of all that data, right, from Metaculus and from Manifold and from our world in data and everything. So not going to touch on this in detail. This is just a very simple workflow. The user, a decision maker, could be an NGO, could be a government, comes in with a question. They want to do a forecast, or they want to measure the effectiveness of an intervention. They first go to the platform, which is it has an LLM that helps them guide them through the process. They check, is there existing models to use straight away? Okay, yes, no. Is there existing data? And if there isn't existing data, the platform, our Delphi collaboration protocol, will help them then put out either a crowdsourced request, which we'll see in the next slide, or an expert request for like expert elicitation and commission that. And if we go to the next slide, like the crowdsourcing is a key part here, right? Like this is sort of Palantir in our world in data, but completely crowdsourced, right? So we'll have an attention allocation mechanism where donors and decision makers can indicate what kind of data do we need, and then people can go out and actually collect that data in surveys or put forecasts on Manifold, or get paid for that, right? We have decision makers either paying to fill the gap in their model, or donors contributing to that. And this is the first use case. We're going to touch just briefly on 2 use cases. This is just very simple. Like, so I'm GovAI. We're doing a risk assessment. I have a model. My model has white space in it where I don't have the data. I go to the platform. I upload the model. I tag the nodes that don't have data. And the model then can either send out a commission expert elicitation, or look at what can we take in from Metaculus or Manifold, or what can we just source from the crowd. And then hey presto, I then have a complete model. And I might pay a small piece for that, but that's it.
Yeah, and then after we build those models, after all that's done, this is an example of what this could look like from an end user who's maybe less technical. You could sort of select what metric you'd be maximizing for. You might even be able to see some sub-metrics. And then you could effectively, we could identify for them the highest impact levers in various scenarios. They'd be able to manipulate those, tinker with some of the inputs. If they want to, they could even double click, view more of the models, which would then open into more of kind of an edit mode for those models.
What we imagine is a open causal modeling system so that you can input various different players' viewpoints on how the underlying causal model could evolve, as well as allowing for easy comparison between different viewpoints. So here we have an imagination of GovAI's rationale for the impact of bioweapons on as a result of LLM release, and Meta's rationale. And so now the two of them can view like what their differences in opinion are on the reason that you don't need to be concerned about the release of LLMs.
I want to briefly mention this is not only for figuring out AI policy, but also general use cases for human well-being, such as sustainability. How can we make the world a better place? Similar resource allocation questions matter. I think we need to validate that this would actually work. We already have organizations literally in our team that would like to create these shared world models. So the budget we would start with would be allocated towards finding the right data for this and coming up with a framework in which as many organizations as possible would be able to use the shared world model. And continue from there towards expanding the scope. I think starting narrow is good on finding a specific use case in which we can test the levers, whether or not the levers make sense, and then track budget allocation decisions or resource allocation decisions towards there. Yep, thank you.
What evidence do you have about the demand side? In other words, how will you address the risk that this is an exercise in creating self-licking ice cream cones?
Do you want to share about this from the model creation?
Yeah, this is evidently quite time intensive, but a lot of times when we create reports, people are confused about how they update over time, and they would like to have dashboards where they can just dial up and down certain risk levels or pretend that you have 5 interventions and try to briefly compare them. And we have some evidence during COVID that these dashboards were actually quite in use.
I can talk really briefly about that. There have been a handful of open modeling technologies that have been used. Like COVID was a really excellent moment for this. It was necessary to do sense making at rapid speed. And so in that context, the access to these open models, you can look at evolution.ml if you want an example of this, of it being put into use. You can talk about this as well, right?
Well, yeah, there's also just a related, say, for instance, in the sustainability space, there's a huge issue where you've got appetite, perhaps at local government level or at regional government level, for things like appropriate policy solutions for their locale right now. But often there's huge issues with data lags and models being appropriate fits for their localized situation, in which case you basically got a kind of too much of a lag to have active implementation, and in this case you can accelerate that process so there can be active uptake, which has actually already begun on a much smaller scale, for instance with plastic pollution, where they've actually been able to scale out smaller versions of models, and it's been actually globally uptaken across the world.
Yeah, sorry, one thing just lastly to add to that, I think like Palantir's market cap is evidence of how at the cutting edge of governmental decision making there is a huge amount of demand for organizations that can create these complex models, both in the military intelligence sphere, but also a lot of their increasing work is done in national health services or mapping COVID pandemics, but it's, I think, not exploited and not maybe by the right kind of organizations.
I think you mentioned a few times about like critical actions. Can you give like a few examples of these and how you plan on like extracting this from your models?
Sorry, what kind of action?
Critical actions?
I can talk about this. These are basically like dose sensitivity effects, and based on what your model might be, you can extract those automatically. So it depends on what the input model is that someone offers, but then you can just essentially run it backwards and find out what the most valuable per input output would be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think one application is for responsible scaling policies where like potentially lab leaders have to come together and decide, oh, actually we have surpassed this threshold or not. And the question is like, what is the data that's used for that, and how do we come to the conclusion that this is actually the case? And then potentially shut things down or not.
Final from the judges?
Maybe as a general comment, it took me a little while to understand what you meant by a world model, and it sounds like you mean like a causal model, like a Bayesian network, or an actual statistical model. And is there any specific class that you're referring to, or can that also be crowdsourced or be very general?
The specific class of causal model? Yeah, so probably it's like a probabilistic Bayesian modeling language like NumPyro or JAX. Yeah.
But you could also imagine very simple models, right? Because this can be crowdsourced both in terms of the data and the models. So you could imagine very simple models. So we're targeting very simple usage for decision makers. Like we're not targeting people who know how to build a Bayesian model.
Yeah, I think the part that makes this interesting, in my opinion, is to be able to create a graph that has some causal relationship between, without even assigning a function between these, and then asking the world, how are these actually related? And having that model be further enriched by multiple strategies. So this is why this being on a collaborative substrate is actually really powerful, in my opinion.
Great, thank you so much.